Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Tim and Shane are back for another philosophy discussion. We're going to go through that book that we started going through last time, the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism, and we're going to go through postmodern art, and then also the essays on film and literature. So, as always, to start off, do you guys want to introduce yourself to those people who don't know you?
Yes, Tim Keefe, repeat offender, especially now.
Yeah,
Soothing, dulcet tones of my voice, and
you're
I know
practically
more
my
about
co-host for this.
postmodernism than anybody else in this podcast, and probably in the circles that Andrew runs in.
Yes.
And I'm very into history, philosophy, and more recently theology. And my agenda is just to learn a little bit more about postmodernism because why not? So I'm sure there's a benefit on the other side. I'm being cheeky, but yeah, I'm just here to learn and to have a good time talking. So.
It's very good of you to be so open-minded about it too, because I know that especially before we got into this, you were very opposed to it. I was too, for the record, before I started learning about it.
Oh, I'm still pretty opposed to it. But I mean I'm blessed slash cursed with being apparently in the 99 percentile for openness. So you can pretty much wave any idea in front of me, and I just have to learn about it. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So you want to do a bit of an introduction to art there, Tim?
Sure. So, as Andrew mentioned, what we're looking at is the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism, which, know, what we covered last time, particularly with the O'Connor essay to start off the collection, is that postmodernism had its heyday in the 70s, 80s, and going into the early 90s to around the mid 90s. That's kind of its arc. And its high water mark was sometime around the 80s and the early 90s or so. once it had its zenith, its sunset down in the mid 90s, people weren't really talking about it until, as I mentioned at the very beginning of these series, until Jordan Peterson brought it back into common consciousness.
It's funny. It's funny how him mentioning that in a negative light has probably gotten so many people to start learning about it.
That's right, and it's kept the academics. Hey, I could trot this stuff out again.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the problem that I have focused on with Peterson is that he makes it into a straw man, a very gross oversimplification about what postmodernism is, and that it's some kind of a philosophy. Yeah, maybe you could describe it as such, but probably not. Particularly, and I certainly hope with Andrew and Shane, is that I've been leading them through the material here, is that that's not the case. There's a lot more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we covered
that boogeyman is very persistent.
Yeah. So the last time we covered some of the introductory essays in the Cambridge Companion. Now we're going to focus on where I think postmodernism really, you could point to this and say, yeah, this looks like postmodernism, and this is a better definition or description of what it is in the art realm. In particular, we're going to look at the essays on art itself, which is, more specifically, painting and sculpture. Also looking at film, and then looking at literature. And in my opinion, something outside of a philosophical discourse, you really want to nail down what postmodernism is, where it flourishes the most, is in literature and literary criticism, which was influenced to a great extent by Derrida. But he did not focus all his attention on literary works or literary theory.
Yeah, he focused on language a lot too, for example, right?
Right, starting with language. But deconstruction itself then became a subject over here in the North American, particularly with the Yale School out of Yale University, particularly in the 1980s, that was influenced by Derrida, but not necessarily of Derrida. Same thing with Lyotard. But that's literary criticism. We'll get to that in a moment. And what I wanted to start off with was the essay by Stephen Melville in the Companion, Chapter 4, which is on page 82. The title is Postmodernism and Art, Postmodernism Now and Again. Okay, so let's see. Trying to get my bearings here. Okay, so I'll start with a quote. This is the second paragraph on the first page, where Melville says, quote, "It does seem to be a distinctive feature of the term postmodern, as it is currently employed, that it can serve, in a way that neither modern nor modernist can, as a qualifier of the word theory. And this is clearly related to the role theory is often said to play in relation to the arts or practices we are tempted to call postmodern. It is as if postmodernity were to be recognized by its affinity for theory, or as if it were the presence of theory internal to those practices that signaled their postmodernity. Of course, that might also mean that postmodernism was itself, first of all, a theoretical development, a transformation in the status or condition of theory. It's coming to have claims and consequences very different from what we have expected of theory or theories." Okay. So the reason why I chose that quote is that he mentions theory. Now, this is where I would go to somebody and say, when you're talking about the postmodern, don't say postmodern philosophy. Rather say postmodern theory.
Okay.
Why? It's because the two, particularly if you look at the history of how it played out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was more of a theory. Okay. Not necessarily a philosophy, but a theory. And philosophy can be a pretty broad term, but theory is an even broader term that incorporates a lot of different things. It could be, I mean, just like the essays are on this companion. Philosophy, film, art, sculpture, performance, space, anything. It's all kinds of theory. And so I would say that, yes, maybe in some respects it's not such a good idea to say postmodern theory, because that's a huge grab bag. On the other hand, when you extend it to theory, you avoid pigeonholing it into one particular thing. So would everybody agree with that? Would you say that, in the relatively short time you've been looking at postmodern stuff, yeah, postmodern theory is a better way to describe some of these things?
That does make more sense now that you mention it too, because it made me think about how I often do use the phrase postmodern philosophy, but postmodern theory probably would be more accurate.
Right, because when you're talking about the arts or literature, it is a theory, just like with literary theory. Not a literary philosophy, a literary theory, literary criticism, things like that.
Yeah.
Film theory, not film philosophy. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing you brought that up. I definitely agree with that. Postmodern theory. That's your biggest grab bag that you could work with. Okay. So then continuing on.
I will just draw attention that you did the theory thing. You mentioned 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I think that's kind of telling to a certain extent, given that the theory label seems to fit a lot more of what we would talk about in those periods. And I would hazard to guess that some of the more current manifestations of postmodernism might be more apt to the philosophical, to being labeled philosophy than, say, perhaps what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I think there is some devils in the details here, where it's like you don't want to paint it with too broad a brush, but at the same time, if you do look at specific manifestations, and I'm not going to make the argument today, but I think we will eventually see that it does manifest. Well, we'll see if it manifests itself as a philosophy at any points in time.
The boogeyman rises.
The boogeyman rises. That's right.
We'll see. Okay, so just note it, and we can move on. So
okay, good point, Shane.
Yeah.
Okay, so continuing on, here's another quote where he says, "Postmodernism is just as the collapse of universals, and so it can only ever be local and strategic, announcing itself only in order to disqualify all those terms that would let it mean and matter the way modern and modernism." Okay, so in previous podcasts, I've made the distinction that postmodern is a reaction to or a result of, in some cases, to the modern. Okay. And I believe in the last podcast when we were covering the companion is what is modernism? Now, modernism in the history of art, history of literature, again, we're going to look at literature in a bit, it has more clearly distinct boundaries. This is the modern period of a particular genre: painting, sculpture, literature, music, so on. Definitely 20th century, late 19th and going into the 20th century. Although postmodern began to emerge, if you want to pick a date, sometime in the 70s, and then going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s arc of the postmodern theory until it just kind of fizzled out. So, collapse of universals. I mean, we kind of see this before. This harkens back to Lyotard, the the incredulity towards the grand narratives. So there's no overarching story that stitches everything together. Everything becomes a little bit more localized, strategic, and then it's again a reaction to the way modernists are. Okay,
Right.
so also with these essays, I'm going to quickly go through them because the authors cite certain artists and artworks, most of which I've never seen, and I'm not going to take the time to look at them. We can't post them up on the Hangout, but if for the home readers, if you are reading through the essays, then just look them up. You might get a better example of that. I've seen certain artworks that could be classified as postmodern. You see them in modern art galleries. Okay, so moving right along. Later on in the essay, Melville says, he's talking about allegory. So does everybody understand what an allegory is?
Yeah.
How would you define an allegory?
Yeah, do a quick rehash. I don't want to take it for granted.
Is it like sort of similar to an analogy?
Not quite.
Okay.
So broadly defined, an allegory is a story that represents something.
Okay.
Maybe to teach a certain thing. Okay, and so allegorical, the adjectival form. Okay, so what Melville says is the rejection of allegory, and here is referring to painting and sculpture, as a way of making a receiving visual art, appears to be one of the foundations of the practices we call modernist. To claim that the work of the postmodern artist is allegorical is to suggest that it visually it appears or behaves more like the work of, say, Poussin than that of Jackson Pollock. Okay, so I don't know who Poussin is, one of the artists.
Oh, okay.
But I do know who Pollock is. Okay, I'm sure everybody has seen a Jackson Pollock painting.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we don't have the means to put up on the screen what the Pollock painting is. But Shane and Andrew, how would you describe a Jackson Pollock painting?
Like for me, I would say weird and confusing.
How about you, Shane?
I actually kind of like Pollock. I do find I think when I think of Pollock, I think of like layers of colors and drops and blots and for me it's very emotional art. Not that I'm terribly familiar with it, but I know some people when they think of postmodern art, they think of things that are like banal in like a dot on a page. But when I think of Pollock, even though it's kind of not as say formed or direct as other forms of art, I still think there's something. I think there's still something there. Like the art snob in me doesn't raise his nose in the slightest. I think, but that's just my take.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that disparagingly. That's just the way it seems to me.
Well, when you say it's emotional, Shane, can you expound on that a bit?
I can screen share a Jackson Pollock painting here, by the way. I think I'll do that.
Yeah,
okay. Just pick a random one.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't I just comment on that? Because I mean, I'm actually, funnily enough, I'm going to the National Art Gallery here in Ottawa on Saturday.
Okay.
Partially because the person I know from Ukraine is actually familiar with postmodern art, and there is some there, and she's going to kind of walk me through her understanding of how the art forms evolved.
So after this podcast, you'll be armed with some knowledge to lay down on her. Hey, I know what you're talking about with postmodern art.
Can you guys see this?
No,
I can't see it.
Okay, let's try that again.
I think you pulled this up.
There we go.
I think you pulled this up before.
What
That's
about
Pollock?
now?
Here we go.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Yep, that's a Pollock.
Yeah. Oh, I like this. I like this more than I thought I did, actually. I must have been confusing him with someone
okay,
else.
that's obviously awesome.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you can see other Pollocks there. Just scroll up a bit.
Like this one?
The one on
Yeah.
the far right. Oh, there's
You mean this one, Shane?
Oh no, that one's fine too. But
Yeah.
even that one, that's to me what I think of when I think of Pollock, is that.
Oh, yeah. I actually like that. That actually looks interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Convergence, 1952. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Andrew, does this bring out an emotional reaction to you when you look at it?
I would say if it brought up a particular emotion, I would say awe.
Awe?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me more.
I'm just like sort of overwhelmed by all the mixture of different colors and stuff like that. It's a lot to process. It's actually kind of beautiful in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would we say that Pollock's paintings represent anything?
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really seem like they do, and maybe that's part of what makes them postmodern.
But would we call them modern or postmodern? That's the question.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I mean, I'm still pretty unsure of what that term means specifically in art, I guess you could say.
Okay, well, let me read the last sentence of the quote again. To claim that the work of the postmodern artist is allegorical is to suggest that visually it appears or behaves more like the work of, say, Poussin than that of Jackson Pollock. And since you can screen share, let's bring up somebody by Poussin. Poussin.
Okay.
I could be wrong with my terms here. I'm gonna say he's straddling the border, Pollock, because I think it is analogous the word we're using? Allegorical.
Allegorical.
I think it could be allegorical. Like sometimes when I get really excited with ideas and a lot of opportunity, I think I feel like that painting. Like it's just there's so many different directions and things buzzing in me that I could say it's an allegory. Like that would be how I feel, and I usually have to just stop working and calm down for about an hour or two, or have a beer, depending on how I feel. So,
Okay, it was actually when I looked that up, it was mostly pictures of ducks, but it looks like this one that I found should be, oops, wrong screen, should be one of his paintings. You see that one?
Yeah. I think it's the same one. Nicolas Poussin, who is a French Baroque painter.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is more in line with what we could consider as possibly modernist. So
okay,
the clear difference here is that Pollock's paintings are abstract,
right?
Whereas Poussin's definitely have a theme involved. Now with the allegory, it is, as I was saying before, an allegory as a metaphor that it's an artistic device that's a metaphor for representing something within the wider world, perhaps a lesson. When you think of medieval allegories, definitely related to Christianity, teaching a lesson, scenes from Christ's life or things like that, heaven and hell, stuff like that. So as I unpack it, the essence of the quote is, to say that the claim of the work of the postmodernists is allegorical suggests that it visually appears or behaves more like the work of, say, Poussin than like that of Jackson Pollock. Okay.
Okay.
So what I take from...
So it's not... so would postmodern not be not allegorical then?
That's what I take from it.
Okay.
Where, Poussin is clearly you are representing something, even though we know it's an artwork. But there are figures, there are landscapes, and so on and so forth. But Pollock, you're just kind of like... what is it? Does it represent anything?
Right.
Not really. Now, sure, as Shane said, it can evince an emotional reaction from you, but what does it teach you? I really don't think anything.
Right.
Just, hey, I'm pretty impressed about Pollock came up with this.
I can see a similarity between that, like beauty for the sake of beauty. I see that in the superficiality of the more of the more philosophical or maybe sociological use of the term postmodern, like is in the postmodern era, like we've talked about before, like Hollywood, for example, building up these spectacles to just show spectacle for the sake of spectacle.
Or I can give you one better. So last month I was in Las Vegas for the first time. And Las Vegas is, you could say, a postmodern city par excellence.
Oh, yeah.
Just as a lot of Southern California, Los Angeles and Hollywood, like you mentioned. And of course, I had seen many pictures of Las Vegas over my lifetime, even going back to what it used to look like before the mega casinos came on the scene. But as you're walking down the Las Vegas Strip, you see things like Paris. That's one of the mega casinos.
Right.
And lo and behold, there's a copy of the Eiffel Tower and a Montgolfier Brothers balloon. And then you walk a little bit further down and you're at the Venetian, where lo and behold, you have a reproduction of the Rialto on the canals in Venice. And then you look at those and you know they're kind of like, I don't know. But then, you know, very much in line with some postmodern themes, they're more real than real.
Hyper real.
Hyper real, yeah. And those certainly are not allegories. Any of the kind of architecture that's there, and that's a whole other subject within postmodernity, is that about architecture. But it's it's definitely weird when you see it up close.
I bet.
Yeah. So just my 2 cents about that.
Yeah,
but
Vegas is funny because I've been there like 3 times, I think, and like the like almost within 10 minutes of knowing that I'd seen all the little spectacles on the strip, it went from being a really good time to being, okay, what am I doing here? It got the moment I knew, because they don't even give you coins anymore, right? Like you don't even get the test.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I didn't go in the casinos. I just went to Las Vegas to go see the Strip, go see a couple shows, and then I got the hell out of there, going to the parks like Death Valley and Pahrump, and I went to Utah. You know, I'm going to go back out to Utah in September and October, so it's a different part of that.
Was Vegas where that unregistered meetup was?
No.
Oh, okay.
The Thaddeus Russell one? No, this past weekend it was here in D.C.
Oh, okay.
The first one was in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
Not in Vegas.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Vegas is a whole other subject to talk about with postmodernity.
Yeah.
But moving right along. So Melville continues. He says, for the traditional allegorist, allegory is a practice of continued metaphor. The ship of state, one metaphor, is by itself a metaphor. But if we continue that metaphor across the entire surface of the canvas, or of the whole length of a poem, so that the waves and storms, the lands and people, safe arrivals and shipwrecks all count in making out the fate of the state, we shall have an allegory, a pictorial or poetic whole that everywhere and consistently means something other than the surface literally shows. Okay, so what he's getting at here is, when you take a metaphor like the ship of state, itself is a metaphor, but if you really run with it and describe how the state is tossed on a violent sea, or the ship runs aground, things like that, then you are really deploying more of a description of what an actual ship would be with the metaphor. Okay, we woven into whatever the allegory is. Okay, so he's kind of hitting more of the point about what a traditional allegory does. And somebody like Poussin, French Baroque painter, definitely paints in allegories, unlike Jackson Pollock. Okay? Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so then it continues on and he discusses about history, postmodern and describing history. So then he says, this work is seen to be renewing a capacity for or engagement with signification that modernism had refused. And in doing so, it is also opening the apparent self-enclosure of the modernist medium, if not exactly to the world, then at least to the full range of discourses through which it appears. Continuing, the notion of a medium remains as central here as it was for modernist art and criticism. But the notion itself has shifted away from something more or less like material presence and toward an emphasis on what is inevitably mediated in it. Okay, so he's drawing a distinction here. So modernism does not play with signification, as postmodern appears to do. The play of signs, the whole thing.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Right.
So, like going back to Poussin, is that we know that it's a painting, we know that it's a representation of something, but it doesn't necessarily signify something. It's more representational. And
Right.
this is what one of the hallmarks of modernism is, a representation. Now, when you get into the 20th century, there's a shift in modernism where you're not going to have a one-to-one type of representation. Again, some of the artists are like Braque, Picasso, the Cubists, even the Impressionists it starts. Paul Klee, people like that around World War I. That's still in the modernist vein, but representation is different. But it's not about pure signification or plays of signs.
So it's like the historical progression of the theory, I guess you would call it, sort of similar to how Zygmunt Bauman talks about how you go from the modern and you transition, and he uses that term liquid modernity for more like where we are today.
Well, there's a different sense of liquid modernity. Remember, he's approaching it sociologically.
Yeah.
So the key point is that modernity is still there, but modernity is not large, classificatory, monolithic, frozen in time almost.
Right. It sounds like based on that quote that they were saying that the art uses the modern medium, but it focuses more on meaning than allegory.
Right.
Would that be accurate? Yeah.
I would say that's accurate because
Okay.
Again, with taking generally speaking, postmodernism does not really concern itself with representation accurately.
Right.
It is more concerned with, instead of the medium is representation, maybe a material reality.
Right.
That the material medium is to represent something else. It's a means to an end. Postmodernity only occupies itself with the means.
Right. So, okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't understand what it would mean to just occupy the means, and I don't know what is signify means. I don't understand.
Okay, well let's look at the difference between the Poussin paintings and Jackson Pollock. Okay, so one could say that Poussin, because he's firmly in a modernist vein, even though it's French Baroque, so we're looking at 18th century, early modernist, we'll say. So you're using the medium, the canvas, the paint, forms to display something. It could be just a simple landscape, figures, or it could be an allegory. Very common in those days. So the means go towards an end of a representation of something. Follow me so far?
Yep, I got it.
Okay, whereas Jackson Pollock, works of art that are in that vein, don't necessarily represent something. It's more of, instead of the paint is to accurately represent something, let's just focus on the paint and see what we can do with it. And that's how Pollock did. You've ever seen photos or videos of how Pollock did his work? He spread the canvas on the floor, and then he took the paint and then he just dribbled it here, splashed it around there, dropped it here to create his works.
It's sort of it's that sort of process sort of reminds me of more of what it's like to write fiction from my own personal experience, because if you want to be a good fiction writer in particular, you have to just follow your intuition, especially if you're doing the first draft of something, because otherwise you might lose your intuition, which is going into all these great places that you can sort of fix the structure and maybe the grammar and spelling a little bit with later.
Right. Now, the thing about literature, because we'll get to this when we get into that essay, one work that the author of the essay mentions is James Joyce's Ulysses, which I've read part of. It was many years ago. But people who try to read Ulysses come away bewildered
Right.
because
Yeah, I've never even tried yet. I
the work
probably will.
itself, if you compare it to Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, it's more of a standard narrative, somewhat autobiographical. Whereas when you get to Ulysses, which was late in Joyce's career, what is it about? Can't really say. It may be about one thing, but then it's about something completely different, or that there's no form or what's the plot or what's the narrative there. And so this is where the postmodernist type of writers with literature are starting to play with the medium. Instead of making it linear, more interruptive. And in fact, in that essay too, what you get to is the author towards the end focuses on things like hypertext,
Right.
which you could say is like that kind
uh,
of a text par excellence postmodern type.
have you read Cloud Atlas?
Yeah.
Because I read that recently, after having already seen the movie, and that seems like a really good example of postmodern literature to me, at least for sure in the terms of the structure, because it jumps back and forward in time, and then in each time period there's a different writing style, and the characters speak in completely different ways.
Right. That was something I was thinking about too, reading the literature essay, is Cloud Atlas. There still is a kind of a conventional narrative at work, but as you pointed out, you see it in the novel and you see it in the movie, it jumps back and forth to highlight the connection with the characters in different time periods.
Yeah.
Yeah, good example. Okay. So back to the essay, Melville continues. He says, whatever the Pollock is, it is also an image and works that way too. And what may bother us in it is the desperation of its attempt to pretend otherwise, to imagine itself as beyond or exempt from such circulation, from reproduction, signification, historicity. The purest works of postmodern allegory are perhaps Sherry Levine's photographic reappropriations of prior photography in their naked assertion of the absolute priority of repetition and mediation over originality and presence. Okay, so as he's saying about Pollock is, it's an image, but it doesn't pretend otherwise.
Right.
And it is also something that could be reproduced fairly easily. Signification, maybe it doesn't signify anything. And historicity is rooted in a particular time. So I've covered this before in other treatments of postmodernism, is that of reproduction, copies of copies of copies of copies. And then that's what he's getting at here is repetition, mediation, originality, and presence. So, in the case of Pollock is, can you really reproduce a Pollock? Maybe not.
Well, maybe you could if you followed it exactly, but it would be pretty hard to do, I would say.
Yeah, it's not like drawing a straight line on a canvas.
Yeah.
You could easily reproduce that.
Yeah.
But the way Pollock did it, he didn't have, he had kind of a method to his madness. But how the painting came out, he probably couldn't have predicted that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. With me so far, Shane? Hello, Shane.
You there, Shane?
Oh no, I'm here. Sorry, I just had to hit my passcode to get back on. No, I'm following.
Okay.
I'm following. It's
Okay.
making sense, and I think I do get what the sign is now. Yeah, that's more that to me. What postmodern art is to me is my definition of art is a more pure expression of the artistic drive. Is how I would describe it. So because it just
That makes
for me
sense to me.
because to me pure art is pure exploration. It would be the most purely artistic thing you could do. It would be purely exploratory, and that seems to be what the means a focus on means would be in my personal lexicon. So
right, and you could say that abstract art is probably one genre that's close to what a postmodern theory of art would be. Pollock happens to be one example of that. But maybe somebody else like a Mark Rothko. You ever seen Rothko's?
I'm not familiar with him.
Shane, do you know Mark Rothko?
I'm going to suspect the answer will end up being no. How do you spell
Okay.
his name? I'm on my computer. I can bring it up. What is it? How do you spell it? Mark?
R-O-T-H Rothko. R-O-T-H-K-O. Mark Rothko. You've probably seen his paintings before, but
I've seen stuff like this.
Mhm.
This is better than what I would have thought it would be if you described it to me out loud.
Yeah, not something that's easily describable.
No.
I can screenshot one of those too.
Sure.
I'm a really big fan of color. So I mean, like, oh, this one's just all orange, and it's orange. You had me at orange. So
Yeah, is this the one you were looking at, Shane?
No, it's 5 to the right of that one. If you did the same Google
This
search,
one?
there it is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, not that one. The one with a little bit of brighter orange. That's too dark.
This one?
No. It was literally that one goes 4 to the right.
Yeah, Rothko was about color, not so much about form.
Yeah.
Because
You
the
mean
forms
this
are
one?
they're pretty uniform.
Here, actually, you know what?
yeah.
I can just turn my camera on.
Yeah, you can screen share too. Either of you can. I'll stop.
No, I can't. No, I'm not gonna be able to do it. No, it's too much. It's bridge too far.
Okay.
Okay.
But I think we get the idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there's, just if you ever get a chance to spend some time in a MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and you'll see things like a Rothko or a Pollock or Andy Warhol is in there. And then you get some more contemporary ones from the past 10 to 15 years where you're just going, huh?
Right.
But then you're like, oh, yeah, well, maybe they're not necessarily trying to represent anything. Might be postmodern. Anyways, back to the Melville essay. So here's another good quote where he says, pop art, okay, this is a distinct genre, appeared in many ways as a simple break with modernism, a refusal or parody of its central terms. So a classic exponent of pop art is Andy Warhol. Marilyn Monroe, the Campbell soup can, the shoes, blah, blah, blah. Okay, minimalism, by contrast, appeared as something closer to an intolerable consequence of these terms. The movement that was understood to lead painting ever closer to its pure central self suddenly appeared to pass right through that self, thus revealed in that passage as empty, into something else. Painting turned out, at its core, not to be painting at all, but merely the deployment of an object in space, and because this was discovered as a fate or fact of painting, the relation of these objects to the kinds of work one recognizes as sculpture was and remains obscure. Okay, so the thing about pop art, Jameson mentions this in Postmodernism of the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. So the painting he focuses on is the one Heidegger does in The Origin of Work of Art, Monet's shoes, peasant shoes, which in Heidegger's description of it point to a world of the peasant, those shoes. So the painting itself is not just of the shoes, but it opens up a world. Versus something like Andy Warhol, which is usually a consumer object, like the Campbell soup can, classic example. But what does it point to? Does it point to a world? One can really not say. It's also something he reproduced can after can after can, Campbell soup label, or the Marilyn Monroe, to use those examples. But it doesn't represent a world. It's also something reproducible. So then, using, Jameson focuses on the term, a parody versus a pastiche. Pastiche is just a jumble of things put together. Doesn't require really any skill to do so. And it might not represent anything. Okay. And so pop art is just taking kinds of pop culture stuff, putting them together and then calling it art. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm not a big fan of pop art, but I've certainly seen enough Warhol.
That just sounds lazy to me.
Oh, I got one better for you. So Andy Warhol was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there is a museum to his art there. I've been to it a couple times. Pittsburgh's a nice city. I remember distinctly there is one towards the end of the exhibit where it's a canvas painted in acrylic, not unlike the Mark Rothko we saw. It's just a deep purple, almost a silver type purple. It's acrylic paint, and there's these blotches on it. Okay. So looking at it, you see this long canvas, this rectangular, deep purple, and these blotches. And then you go look at the description, what it is and its origins. And that Warhol did it in a studio, and he and his friend at the time, they just pissed on it. And that explains the blotches. Okay. And then you sit there and you look at it and you're just like, I could have done that.
Yeah.
But you didn't.
But I didn't, and this thing is worth how many millions of dollars?
Yeah.
Anywho.
I want to just flag one thing is that the idea that you could even have pop art, there's a base assumption there that you can have action without meaning and significance.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, but I just want to say that because postmodern is juxtaposing itself by definition by using that one may juxtapose is not the correct term, maybe it's contrasting but anyway, in relationship to something modern, right? And so in a traditional worldview or religious worldview, everything has meaning, everything is a sacred act, right? If you go back far enough. So you can step outside that prism and you can say, and maybe you're correct, that you're operating without meaning. There's no sacred expression here. There is no larger significance. I just want to flag the idea that that's, from a different point of view, that's an impossibility. Like you could not do that. It would not even be a thing. So you can make your decision what presupposition or assumption you want to make going into it. But I just want to flag that there is that tension there. And I would say that like for instance with Andy Warhol, you could say it's pop art, but it's also a very meaningful expression of consumerist society, you know. So and the meaning behind the transition society, what that means for our lives, and then on and on and on and on and on. There's a lot of stuff there. So in some ways, it's saying almost as much as a depiction of Christ on the cross, in the sense that there's a whole bunch of nested ideas inside that what might otherwise be a superficial coloring of a Marilyn Monroe photograph. So
right.
You have a nice superficial pink coloring around you.
I know, isn't that a happy coincidence? Maybe that's a sign. You know, it's like it's my halo.
It looks very Mark Rothko.
Yeah, there you go.
Just need to get orange, Shane.
Yeah, that would be much better. Yeah,
would you say there's like deep nested signification in Jackson Pollock or something, for example?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would not say so because it's abstract.
Yeah.
Well, but why would he choose to express himself that way? Because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's why is a man making this painting? Why is this painting on this wall? Why am I looking at this painting and not a modernist painting? What does it say about my society that a painting that would have been garbage, 200 years ago wouldn't have been noticed, presumably, now all of a sudden commands this respect? So, I mean, it really depends on how you want to scope the thing or what level of analysis you want to look at it through. So, which just comes back to my point that I just want to draw attention that within a certain paradigm, I completely agree with you, Tim, within a certain paradigm, it's not really saying anything. Right. Within another paradigm, which especially if you're postmodernist, could be just as legitimate, from my point of view, would be the more legitimate one. It could be saying a lot. So I just want to draw attention to the fact that it really depends on what base assumptions you're approaching the situation with.
This is just like a different, like you were saying, it's a different way of evaluating what you choose to define as meaning. If you choose to look at it that way, then you can, but then you can look at it at the other way too. And that's where I mean, it makes more sense to me to look at it at the former way than the latter way, like that that a Jackson Pollock painting, like the ones we looked at, for example, doesn't really have any meaning other than just to express beauty or something like that, I guess. But those are just different, like you said, different ways to evaluate what meaning is in this context.
Right. Okay. So good points. And moving on, here's an important section of the Melville essay. So here, this is on page 89, the last paragraph. He's focusing on some, I guess you could say, core characteristics of what one says is the postmodern. So one of them is, he says, a practice of quotation or appropriation clearly central to much of the work. Okay. So quotation, quote, postmodernism, quote, modern. Okay. Kind of avoiding an essentialist definition of what those terms are. We would refer to X, Y, and Z as modern or postmodern or something like that. So that's the practice of a quotation. Or an appropriation. You're taking from something else. It's not original. Okay. That's one characteristic. Second characteristic is a placing of the subject, both authorial and represented, in question. Okay. So, like in the case of the Pollock painting, what's represented? Well, we can't really say because it's not as definite as, say, at the Poussin, where we see maybe a Christ figure there.
Right.
Okay. A third characteristic, he says, a studied distance from such terms as originality, quote, and quote, genius, in favor of a practice oriented to mediation and repetition. Okay, we saw this before. Is a postmodernist type of work is nothing original. It's maybe appropriated a copy of something, twisting it around, parodying it or something. And then a genius is it does not spring an original work from the person's mind. It is rather just something you hastily cobble together. Okay? Another characteristic, a marked interest in rhetorical or signifying excess, and an equally marked engagement with discursive structures that function not simply in art, but in visual culture more broadly. Okay.
Oh, so that reminds me of like similar to literature that we were talking about, breaking the standard narrative or the standard narrative structure of the 3 acts, and then you have the conclusion and events are in sequence rather than just playing with that and jumping back and forth in time and switching writing style or switching dialogue style and so on and so forth.
Right, or it could be wordiness.
Yeah.
Focusing a lot more on words themselves rather than what words mean.
Yeah.
That's what he means by the rhetorical or the signifying excess.
Okay.
Okay. Focusing, again, core postmodern term is that it's not a one-to-one representation. You're not trying to convey something truthful, you could say, factual, you could say, but rather let's just run with the words themselves and see what we can come up with, combining together. Could be nonsense, or it could point to something somebody looks at and, man, that's really deep. It points to something just timeless, eternal that you couldn't do in logical language.
Right.
Or it could just be complete and utter bullshit.
Right.
Yeah. Like what's that movie? What's that movie? Mulholland Drive?
Mulholland Drive. Yeah.
That's what the woman who goes to LA, right?
That's right.
I've never seen that movie.
Oh, well,
that's
that's David. That's. I think they call that David Lynch's one of his best movies, Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So if you haven't seen any David Lynch movies, I would recommend Mulholland Drive, and what's another good one? Twin Peaks. He did the Twin Peaks show.
Oh, okay. Did he do that Dune movie that was made in the 80s?
Yeah, but that's a more standard narrative. His is more like the visual style.
Okay.
But when you get into Mulholland Drive, it's definitely operating on a deeper psychological level. I mean, there's lots of interpretations behind it. Same for Twin Peaks.
Okay.
But yeah, you could say that film-wise, that's a good example of it's not about a core narrative. or maybe it is in some respect, but it's just, if it shocks you, it bewilders you, and it's operating on a deeper level, that you really got to step outside of your, okay, this is the definite formulaic approach to this movie or a narrative, a plot. No. I remember I saw Inland Empire. That was his latest one, long one. And I'm just going like, huh? This is a 3-hour movie. Damn near.
Oh, wow.
It's like, whoa.
Yeah. What I've had a long discussion about Mulholland Drive, and it's my interpretation of it is it's very postmodern in the sense that I think it might signify something, but I don't think it represents anything. And I think people with, let's say, more modern in the definition that we've been using in terms of modernist, they'll look at it and they'll assume, because they assume it's representing something, their mind naturally projects all these meanings and interpretations on it. And I think David Lynch plays with that by only playing with the medium, only signifying. He knows that a modernist eye is going to fill in all the meaning that he didn't have to even build into it, because he can just throw that canvas, and you're just going to. And for me, somebody who very much who likes things to be representational, I get very frustrated, because I'm like, I'm not going to do the work for you, friend. It's like, you're not allowed to just throw a bunch of stuff up and I'm going to insert all this meaning and call you genius for doing it, which I guess is maybe isn't his point. So maybe I'm forcing my values on him when I expect that. But that was my kind of takeaway, where it was like, fair enough, enjoy it as a postmodern thing, but if you're going to start trying to assume it represents things, that's where I start to take issue with it. So that's my 2 cents, but I think you'd like it a lot, Andrew. So
yeah, that's a very good point, Shane. I mean, there are some films even going further back that, I mean, what's another good one I can think of?
How old is Mulholland Drive? When did it come out?
2002, early 2000s. Yeah, so it's not that old.
What about my favorite movie, Pulp Fiction?
That was 93.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. With
that's kind of postmodern in a way, because it's a disjointed narrative.
Yeah, and there are lots of ambiguous aspects of the film that spark a whole lot of theories, like what's that gold thing in the suitcase?
In the suitcase, and in the briefcase, all
that.
Yeah. But I'm thinking of another movie that is actually much older. It came out in the 60s, and it's the basis for 12 Monkeys. You ever seen that movie?
Yeah, I've seen that. That's a Terry Gilliam film.
That's a Terry Gilliam, yeah. And Terry Gilliam is another good one for kind of a postmodernist theme, even though it's not like, I thought Shane really made a good point, is that in David Lynch's films, it's signification. Like he says, I ain't going to do the work for you, pal, to come up with this conventional narrative and what the meaning is behind it. That's up to you. What you think you're seeing, this is what Lynch is saying to the viewer. What you think you're seeing may not be what is there.
I was saying that to him. So I don't know how David Lynch would represent it, but if he were to say it is a meaningful movie, or I had a point, or I had a vision, like if he tries to imply there was any ends there, that's what I would take issue with, because to me it's pure means. And so people would use words, comes back to exact words you use. If they were to use the word genius, I would take issue with that, because there's no intention to inspire there. To me, it just is playing with the means, with the form. So the meaning. That's the point, right? I don't want to do the work for him, in the sense that I don't want to be the one to actually pull the meaning out of it, because I make it, because I project it into the medium. Because I don't mind if it's like Pulp Fiction, where it's like, okay, leave me enough ambiguity that I can interact, we can co-create. I'm comfortable with that. But I don't know if Lynch has done his side of that co-creation bargain, again, which is me enforcing my values on him for what art should be. But some people think it's super deep, or has all these, and when they say deep, to me that's a representational statement, right? Because it's representing something, and I don't think it's doing that. I think it is postmodern in this Pollock sense of signification. So
you can read into it many different things, but Lynch himself is not going to say this is the definitive meaning. He definitely doesn't do that. Yeah. So, Andrew, if you get a chance, watch Mulholland Drive.
Sure.
And if you
And
do
on that
watch it, there's a really cool Peterson talk on Mulholland Drive. It's one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, I've seen that one too. I think it's pretty good because he's, as a trained psychologist and definitely a Jungian, tries to get down to the quote deeper meaning of what it is.
Right.
But that's just one interpretation. You can read into it many different things. And on that note, I finished the Melville essay. Okay. So I kind of skipped over a lot there because he's talking about different artworks, but I think that what I had read, the last one, summarizes some good characteristics of what the postmodern approach is. The rhetorical and significatory excess. Okay, we're not so concerned about showing meaning. We're just playing with the words and playing with the medium. And definitely is not allegorical. And what else did he say? Questioning originality and genius. And then placing in question authorial and represented. Okay. So a lot of this incredulity going along.
Right.
Okay. Any questions?
I have none.
Okay.
Do you have any personal favorite examples of postmodern art, Tim?
A postmodern art. Well, let's see. I would put Pollock into that category, as I would a lot of abstract artists. Although that's, I mean, what's another good example I can think of? Roy Lichtenstein. You know him, the comic artist. You've probably seen it. You don't have to do a screenshot, but that's another example.
No, sorry, I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, and as far as what else could be, I mean, a lot of modern art you could say is kind of postmodern in a way, but it's really difficult to come up with examples because I've seen so much of it, and a lot of it is just forgetful. It's not worth a second glance at it. It's just, and I don't think it's that profound either. I mean, I know here in DC in the American Art Gallery there is one piece. I think it's still there. It's a huge work. It's a bunch of TV screens superimposed on a metal map of the United States, and each one of the screens represents some scene from that particular state. Utah, California, Florida, something like that. And they're not necessarily recent. Some of them could be like years old, but they're just playing like this film piece. And that's a kind of artwork that strikes me, just the sheer size of it and the sheer effort and craft that went into it. And does it represent something? Yeah, in a way it does. And is it postmodern? I don't know. It's such a slippery term.
Right.
So that's a hard one.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm finished with my essay. Does anybody want to jump in with film?
Yeah, that's one of the ones that I took notes on, actually.
Okay, so this is Chapter 2, Catherine Constable, Postmodernism in Film, on page 43.
Okay. Let me get to my notes here.
We've already touched on a little bit with David Lynch for film.
Yeah, that's true. Let me see. Did I put my film? No, that's my literature notes. My film notes are on my phone here. Okay. Yeah. So I copied down a bunch of different quotes from that. We don't have to go through all of them because, wow, I'm just realizing how many parts I quoted here. But so the first one that I copied down here is one of Baudrillard's key theses is contained within the title of the first work in his compilation volume, Simulations. The procession of simulacra reverses the traditional mimetic relation between art forms and reality, in which the image is said to be a copy of the real. The title asserts that the simulacrum or image has ontological priority and thus precedes the real. Baudrillard explains this reversal with reference to Hollywood disaster movies. It is pointless to laboriously interpret these films by their relationship with an objective social crisis. It is in their direction that we must say it is the social itself which, in contemporary discourse, is organized according to a script for a disaster film. The effect of granting precedence to the disaster movie and other images is that the real itself becomes film-like. That reminds me of the hyperreal that we talked about before. Baudrillard's analysis of America demonstrates this point in that he views the country through the lens provided by Hollywood cinema. It is not the least of America's charms that even outside the movie theaters, the whole country is cinematic. The desert you pass through is like the set of a Western, the city a screen of signs and formulas. It is this sense of a reality that has been completely pervaded by cinema, resulting in the apprehension of the real as film, which is one of the key metaphors for the postmodern. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting quote, like how Hollywood is sort of like affecting our culture and making us see the world like a movie in a way.
Right. So some other points about that. With the simulacra, this is something I mentioned in when I discussed it with James in our podcast series, is that it's turned on its head. So in the sign regime, the sign had a one-to-one. Mimetic is mimesis, which is the one-to-one representation, copying, which, at least on the surface, like a common sense approach to art, is that that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to represent something. That's mimesis.
Right.
So this has been divorced. So, like we were saying with the Pollock, is that the Pollock does not have a one-to-one representation of anything, at least on the surface, at first face. Rather, it is something else. It exists in and of itself. And then this is what Baudrillard calls the simulacrum. So when he says it has ontological priority, it means it then comes before the real.
Right.
So
So
the sign has become the simulacrum. Well, first the sign was detached and divorced from reality. Then it became the simulacrum, which exists on its own, and it doesn't have any connection necessarily with the real.
right. So it's sorry, go ahead, Shane.
No, I just say that sounds so much like the type of Nietzschean philosophy that he was trying to create, because that seems like it's trying to represent itself as free from metaphysics to a certain extent. It does seem to be trying to represent itself that way.
Yeah, and then when
I interpreted that, correct me if I'm wrong, but as more as like it's trying to be its own type of metaphysics, separate from the way we would normally define that, like separate from reality or something like that.
Well, no, wait a minute. Look at the term ontological, not
Right.
metaphysical. Metaphysics broadly defined as a representation of what is behind reality.
Yeah. Metaphysics would be that.
But ontology is about being. So the simulacrum is a being itself, exists on its own.
Okay.
It's not pointing to something behind it. It exists on its own. Now, the quote there about the disaster film is a really good one, because we've seen a lot of disaster films in our life.
Yeah.
We kind of know we kind of know what's going to happen in a disaster film, even if it involves something like the new Godzilla movies. Okay, Godzilla was a threat in the first one. He's going to be sort of a hero in the second one because King Ghidorah is going to be the main nemesis. Okay, we know how this is going to play out, more or less. And those of us who've seen the original Godzilla movies really know how this is going to play out. It's just better CGI.
Right.
But with a disaster film, how often does that kind of disaster exist in real life? One wonders. But running with Baudrillard's theme is that life then becomes the movie, plays out like a movie, or that people are looking at it and expecting it to be like a movie because they've seen so many movies. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me. It kind of reminds me of how an aspect of our culture today is that people are becoming more depressed and taking antidepressants and stuff like that. And I wonder if that's partially due to these expectations of life to be like Hollywood and stuff like that. Like everything's you're going to achieve these amazing goals and everything's going to turn out exactly the way you want it to and stuff like that.
Yeah, but that's nothing new.
Yeah.
Lots of young people have gone through that. I think with the younger generation is that it's become more hyper real and more focused because when I was growing up, it was the movies and TV, which had a different form back in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
Reality TV shows didn't exist back then. If you
Right.
want to watch a reality TV show, it was called the news, as much as it could be. But then when reality TV came on the scene, you're just like, well, these people, and it's scripted, seem more real, hyper real, closer to what reality is, because you're going into average people's quote houses, like these housing shows, fixer upper type shows.
Yeah.
You're going in there and they look just like me. They live in the same town just like me. They don't live in Malibu or New York, some places like that. And then you're just like, well, my life is not like theirs. What happened? It's more compressed, say.
Right.
And then you're expecting that life will turn out like a reality TV show or a movie or a TV show.
Yeah.
So, yeah, good point. Becoming depressed. A symptom of a hyper real.
It's funny you say that because my friends and I had a theory since about high school that a lot of the way we saw people approaching relationships was like too much Grey's Anatomy. Like it's like they just acted out this assumption. Well, if I'm in a relationship, then obviously it's going to be a big blow up. So that's what has to happen when there's a disagreement, because
Right.
that means what's going to happen next is there's going to be this passionate reconciliation. And then in reality, actually, no, if you yell at people, like get super emotional, that doesn't like there isn't a screenwriter, shoe holding a heart to heart moment that's going to happen the next day where where they can cut to the steamy shower scene. So it's the hyper real kind of art imitating light kind of thing. We can move on, but this idea that you can have this ontological object floating in being, I don't think that's possible. I think that's what Nietzsche was trying to claim you could do, or you could actually step outside of the framework in that way. So unless I'm misunderstanding it, I that's just an assertion that has no basis in reality, which is what I feel like a lot of the boogeyman of postmodernism would end up being. So,
well, what about your David Lynch example? Like you said, you were talking about how there's no underlying meaning there. So wouldn't that mean that it's possible?
Well, the underlying meaning there isn't. He didn't put it there. Okay, but the fact that he would choose to make a movie without underlying meaning, now we're back at the whole painting thing, to me, that says a lot. And the fact that somebody would watch that and see meaning there, despite the fact that the person didn't intend it to be there, and it probably isn't there by most definitions of is or real, the meaning cascades, right? So
this is where like I was saying before when we mentioned this, that it like you were saying, it depends on how you decide to analyze what meaning means in that particular context.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I mean, I'm of the school of thought, like computers, people who do, this is a Peterson quote, but it's when you program an artificial intelligence to see the world, your values define your ability to see. Your ability to construct a reality is predicated on values which filter things in and filter things out. So the very definition of seeing is an expression of value. And so that's why you can't escape metaphysics, you can't escape value systems, because you're not interpreting everything around you undifferentiated. The moment you differentiate, you're expressing implicitly or explicitly a value structure, a hierarchy. Da 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 da.
It's
So,
also not context free.
yeah, it's not context free.
Not
So
context free.
now that being said, to give a nod, like you can enter in that exploratory space and kind of try to turn off that free, try to escape by downplaying to what extent your values are reflected in what you're looking at. You can do that as an exploratory thing, or as an artistic expression. I'm not saying there's no value there, or you can't do something approaching that, but if I'm understanding this ontological thing, it's like, to say that is what it is. I don't know. I don't see how you can escape this conundrum. Like, because I mean, I understand what they would try to do it. To me, I was just trying to point of continuity. It seems like if postmodernism is referencing Nietzsche, if Heidegger was a predicate, was a step towards the postmodernist way of looking at things, I do see this attempt to kind of step outside the framework in the way you're expressing yourself.
Well, I think like you were saying, it's sort of more of an attempt, at least explicitly, like it's more of an exploratory or artistic or creative type of thing. Seems that way to me anyway.
Well, it's again non-representational.
Yeah.
The main thing. Now, going back to Lynch for just a minute, is Mulholland Drive is also dreamlike in its quality and in its structure. Now, the thing about dreams, just very shortly, I don't want to go too much on this tangent, is that number one, we can assert that dreams are real. Maybe definitely not physically real, but real in a certain sense. And number two is they have they might have some kind of meaning behind them, but no definitive meaning. Like, for example, I don't remember my dreams. I'm sure I do. Unlike my girlfriend, she really remembers her dreams vividly. But there's one dream I remember in particular. This happened many years ago. It was 3 dogs flying towards a green sun. That was my dream.
Okay.
Now, what does it mean? Hell if I know.
Yeah.
I didn't take the time to try to plumb the depths of that one, but that kind of dream sticks in my memory. One of the very, very few in my life that I remember.
Yeah. Well, like a long time ago now, I read Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, and I thought it was really fascinating. But I mean, even Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, famously, right?
Yep. Bingo.
Yeah.
Yep.
My respect for the Freud, the Mulholland Drive just jumped, because it is very dreamlike. I remember a lot of my dreams. I've vividly dreamed. I remember what I was doing in my dream last night. And I know in my dreams, a lot of things are kind of implicit. So like a character in a dream can be one way, and then it can shift, and I can just understand that, no, actually there's this thing that's changed the reality of the character, and then the main character of the movie, she's pretty much different people at different points. So in that way, it's kind of episodic, in the sense that even though the character was this character, this naive character at the beginning, less naive character others, they're somehow the same, but they're also not the same at all, right? And that's very dreamlike in terms of how I experience, how I interpret what is in a dream. It's very fluid, things in a way that obviously reality isn't, but in a way that can kind of shift, that I think that Mulholland Drive does capture quite nicely, actually.
Yeah, no, also tied in with the simulacrum is that the character in the beginning represented something, but then she changed. This is not necessarily Mulholland Drive either. These are movies like it. The character changes to something else, but then it might change so much that what does the character really represent? Is there any person? Is there, number one, is there any personality there? Is there any motive there? Or whatever. And that, I would say, is a good approximation of a simulacrum. The character that is devoid of something that props it up in the back. Because when you look at a standard character in a film or literature, or whatever it is, personality, motive, history, things like that. And all that's divorced in the case of the simulacrum.
Now I really don't like postmodernism because I think I have a begrudging, I now have a begrudging respect for some meta interpretation of Lynch that might even be credible to him. And this is I don't like where this is leading.
Well, Lynch is not everybody's cup of tea. We know this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like Hawkins and Dawkins must have felt, sorry, Harris and Dawkins must have felt when they're like, hey, maybe religion's an evolutionary phenomenon. And then Dawkins like, well, that would suck. And Harris was like, ha ha. And they just kept talking as if they hadn't said that. I feel like I think maybe Peter Lynch is super meta and actually kind of representing like some basic psychological function in the way that he's presenting ideas, kind of like the way you interpret reality in some way. It's like, better not think about that anymore.
Shane, that's really meta, man.
Yeah, man. Geez, I didn't. Good thing I've been turning off the camera when Andrew's been passing me the bong through the screen. We don't want to reveal how that magic trick is done. So,
all right, Andrew,
you should watch this interesting debate I watched yesterday. Sort of debate on the agenda with Steve Paikin that I've sent you a few videos from. It's this debate with Jordan Peterson and other people as well about whether faith is inevitable.
Oh, weird. I'm surprised I haven't seen that one. That must have been really early. He must have still been overweight and drinking Coke, right? That Peterson. The chubby
that way. Yeah.
Yeah, the chubby Peterson. I'm surprised I haven't watched that one. That's interesting. Maybe I did.
Link for it.
Yeah. I thought I caught up on all the backlog Peterson right when I started, but I guess I missed one or two. Shame on me.
Oh yeah.
Let's not go down the Peterson rabbit hole. Andrew, press on.
Okay. All right. So the next note that I copied here is, where is it? Okay. Yeah, this one's a little bit shorter. Baudrillard, this is related to that first one about what Baudrillard said too. Baudrillard's gleeful acting out of the role of agent provocateur can be seen to add an enjoyable vitality to the theoretical debates concerning the postmodern, as well as constructing him as the self-styled bad boy of the postmodern theorists. So I'm a little confused about what that means overall, but does it seem like Baudrillard is being subversive, basically?
Oh, most definitely. In fact, I pointed that out to James when we did our series. I told him specifically that you can't take Baudrillard at face value.
Right.
A lot of the time, because what he says is pretty out there.
Okay.
And, calling him an agent provocateur, that's credible. And saying that he's a playful theorist in some ways, but in other ways he's actually quite serious in the way he approaches things. I would say he's kind of like one of a postmodern theorist par excellence. He writes about signs. He writes about the hyperreal. He writes about some pretty far out topics. He certainly doesn't take himself seriously, and he parodies himself in times.
Right. I think that's an understandable reason that people like Shane and Jordan Peterson, and not to disparage either of you, would not like that because they don't take themselves seriously enough. Would I be right about that, Shane?
I don't have a problem with not taking things seriously. Like I have a hard time doing that, for the last decade or whatnot, but I can definitely do it at times. It's a lot of fun. My issue is like, it's one thing not to take yourself seriously in whatever medium you were just talking about. It's another when that same person is the next day going to propose a law or propose an educational program or have an opinion on a social matter. It's like, well, which is it?
Oh.
Do you look at the world in a way where you take things seriously, or do you just kind of jump in, have an opinion, and then when pushed, oh, I'll not be too serious, but actually, no, you have to agree with me. So, but I'm just having fun. Oh, but actually, I'm morally superior to you. It's like this, when you jump back and forth too much, it's like, well, dude, if you're not taking things seriously from 8 to 5 o'clock, and then you check into Serious Town at 5:30, why do you think you have that skill set? Like, you think because I can't just flip myself from one type of person to another every minute. Where does this ability happen in you? So I don't have a problem with people enjoying themselves as long as we're transparent about what's going on, and
this description that you're giving of like a bad example of someone behaving this way reminds me of Trump.
The postmodern president.
Yeah.
It's so postmodern. It's funny because when we talked about, you mentioned earlier directional in the context of art and signification, right? Mm-hmm. That's actually the exact language that with the Trump whisperer, what's his name? Scott Adams uses. Yeah. He's directionally true.
Yes.
It's like he's directionally, it's like the details are all off, but he's pointing towards the truth, even if it's hyperbolic and
yeah.
Yes. What was it from the Melville essay? The rhetorical surplus, I think it was, something like that. So
yeah.
And Adams, I paid attention to him in the beginning, not long after the election. Because Adams approaches it from hypnosis and persuasion. Yeah. So I thought he was spot on in his descriptions of Trump being very rhetorically effective, even though he's not truthful.
Yeah.
Or does not appear to be truthful. And that just bugs the shit out of a lot of people, is that he's not factual, he's not truthful. Well, he's a politician.
And he's also a troll.
In spite of himself, and kind of a troll in that you get all bent out of shape because of his tweets, of the things he says, but you're just like, look, this guy is not a professional politician. This guy is a reality TV show star, and this guy is a shameless, relentless self-promoter and has been doing it for years. You didn't know this? You did not know this, and Trump is how old? 70 years old?
Yeah.
He's no spring chicken. He's not some Johnny come lately to the scene. He's been doing this shit for years.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I don't take issue with him, because everybody, like, nobody of any respectability would claim he's otherwise. So it's like he can lie all he wants, but like everybody realizes it. But I mean, yeah. I would say I would argue that whether it's a liberal politician up here north or Barack Obama, they're just as phony. They're just only as directionally true. You guys won't agree with me, but there's just as much superficiality there. But they still.
I agree with you about like in comparison to Justin Trudeau, for example.
I was just going to say is that of the two of them, Justin Trudeau is inscrutable.
Yeah,
to me.
And I'm saying that as a person who voted for Justin Trudeau. So
well, it's the pretext that he has that he's not that. Like Trump can come out and say, "I'm the smartest of the smart." Okay, but like nobody believes that. It's true. But Trudeau comes out and goes, no. But seriously, guys, like I'm really serial here. I am actually a good person. Now, I just fired a woman of color who disagreed with me for political expediency. But I mean, I'm totally a feminist, guys. Totally a feminist. Right up until but I'm totally the best guy ever, right? And then other people will come up and tell you the same thing. And then it's that hypocrisy that just like. I just want to like go into a church and overturn money lending tables, even if I have to bring them in. Even if I have to bring them in myself, and they're like, "Why did you put these here?" Oh, and then
calm down, Shane. Calm down.
You have betrayed my message.
Yeah. Where's that bong you were talking about?
I put it away now.
Okay, but Andrew, press on.
All right. So, the next note that I took is. In Postmodernism and consumer society, Jameson provides a three-stage analysis of the development of capitalism, correlating each new economic order with the emergence of a new type of social life and the emergence of new formal features in culture. The first stage, market capitalism, is characterized by industrial growth that creates goods for national markets. This classic era of capitalism marks the heyday of the nuclear family and the rise of the bourgeoisie, both of which are reflected in the dominant aesthetic form of realism. The second stage, monopoly capitalism, conforms to the age of imperialism and is characterized by the creation of world markets, organized around nation states. In this stage, the cultural dominant is modernism. The third and final stage is that of multinational capitalism, which is marked by the development of global markets and the undermining of national boundaries. This current era of multinational capitalism is characterized by the rise of bureaucracy, signaling the demise of the bourgeois individual subject of the classic era. The cultural dominant is postmodern, which is seen as the reaction against modernist art forms. So that's interesting to me because he talks about different stages of capitalism and how they affect culture, and how the postmodern is a reaction to the modern, and how it goes from the first stage of capitalism all the way to like what I would define as kind of globalism today, and how that affects the aesthetic way that we look at art as well,
Right.
and even reality.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Frederick Jameson here, the Marxist,
Yeah.
who in any treatment of postmodernism you focus on, because he, in the 80s, that's when his first essay appeared, and then the book came later, of what this whole postmodernism thing is. David Harvey is another one too, but he's often not treated in essays for some reason. That and I told James, he focused on this, isn't it interesting that a Marxist would be the one to give a really good description or a diagnosis of what postmodernism is?
Yeah.
And you're right, because the Marxists, in fact, Thaddeus Russell talked about this this past weekend, is that he kind of touched on it, is that Marxists don't like postmodernism. It's because it doesn't really say much.
Yeah.
Also, it undermines any kind of group solidarity, class structures, the whole classic Marxist narrative that's surrounding that. And Lyotard talked about the incredulity of meta-narratives, of which Marxism was an important one, and the mental masturbation point of it.
Yeah.
However, because of late capitalism, which is globalized, that's what we saw starting in the late 80s, actually kind of in the 70s with financialization, moving through the 80s and into the 90s, a globalized world where the nation states start to dissolve. The modernist forms, which is large, monolithic states, nations, things like that, all dissolve into this kind of undifferentiated mass, and the center doesn't hold. The floor drops out from under it. And so postmodernism as an art form, and postmodernity as the state of affairs, and hearkening to Bauman, emerges because of a late capitalist globalized world that we now find ourselves in.
I was just thinking, do you think that people like Jameson, for example, who is a Marxist, describing and defining the postmodern, do you think that's part of why some people conflate postmodernists with Marxists?
I think so. It's because the two are inextricably linked. When you look at a treatment of postmodernism, there's always a Marxist involved in some respect, or they focus on, like Jameson. Jameson is a Marxist. David Harvey is a Marxist, yes, but they are critical of postmodernity. That kind of gets glossed over. For some reason.
People seem to miss that point.
Yeah, there aren't too many fans of postmodernity or postmodernism.
Yeah.
Case in point, Jordan Peterson, or this group that we talk about. The people are like, yeah, I can't stand postmodernism. It's a bunch of bullshit. I don't know what it just incites so much resentment or hostility in people when they look at it, because it's in a sense reactionary, and it undercuts it jabs at you. If you thought that you were firm in your resolve, your beliefs of the world, then postmodernism comes along, however you wish to describe it. It just completely cuts you off at the knees. No wonder you get pissed off.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But not very many people take a step or two back and are just like, okay, what's this whole postmodernism thing?
Yeah.
Which is what I tried to do with James, and what we're trying to do now. I'm not trying to defend postmodernism at all. I'm trying to describe it a little more in depth versus the gross oversimplification straw man approach that certain people take.
Yeah, and the with those intentions, and what you're doing helps me a lot too. Like, it helps me understand it better, and also, I mean, at the same time, kind of understand why people are critics of it a little more too, because I guess when I when I first kind of like became a fan of postmodernism, I kind of probably defend it too much sometimes. So helping to understand the critics more is very helpful too.
Yeah, Thaddeus Russell I wouldn't say he's a fan, but he's a supporter of it.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, he's going to be debating Stephen Hicks, who wrote that terrible book on postmodernism.
Oh wow, that'll be interesting.
sometime in New York. And I'm a member of the private Facebook group, and I found Cuck Philosophy's critique of Stephen Hicks. I posted it on there. I said, for Thaddeus Russell, if nothing else, you can tear into Hicks because of his shoddy scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yep, taking Foucault out of context and misrepresenting him, for example.
So I'll have to look up that video, because one thing that gets me very upset when I talk to Marxists, I don't usually do it anymore, is they'll say, well, for technical reason 1, 2, 3, you misquoted it, so I'm going to use all these scholarships that I have that you don't, even though your primary point about what I'm saying is completely correct. But you quoted page 2 instead of page 3, and you picked the wrong quote to prove a point you could have proved with a different quote. So rather than actually addressing the thrust of the criticism that's being made, I'm just gonna ask for your bibliography repeatedly instead of actually dealing with the issue at hand. So
wow, a peevish and a dogmatic Marxist. Who would have thought?
Yeah, I see what you mean, but like people can get that way for sure. But you should watch that video. It's only like 20 minutes long. It's like for example with Foucault, like the way that Cuck Philosophy points it out, or I don't know what you would call him, but let's call him that. He points out that with some of the Foucault quotes, for example, Stephen Hicks will quote one paragraph, but he won't quote the paragraph before that explains what he's attempting to do with this paragraph. So you can misinterpret it as him being serious or advocating for something, whereas if you read the paragraph above it, it's clear that he's describing something. For example,
that's a classic cherry picking, taking a quote out of context.
Yeah.
Well,
which
maybe that
one would hope no serious scholar ever does. On the other hand.
Yeah,
well, that's kind of what I would. I think my attitude towards that is, I think maybe after we finish going through this whole book, not that we're talking so much about Foucaultian versions of postmodernism per se, but maybe by the end of it, go back and look at something like that, because I'm really curious. I'm trying to avoid having to really read the source material of either Hicks or Foucault, but still try to have an opinion on it. So don't
Foucault
really
books are pretty short. Foucault books are pretty short. They're like 200 pages.
Are they now?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty short, but don't be fooled by the length.
Yeah, they're really extremely.
He squeezes a lot in the 200 pages.
Yeah.
And don't forget that Foucault was very historically informed. So he spent many hours in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, poring over obscure documents that few people had ever heard of. However, they are important source materials for his overarching thesis.
Yeah.
I've waded through a lot of crap at this point. So I mean, well, no, but I mean, and I don't mean crap. Sorry, crap was the wrong word, because like I've read some existentialist philosophy, like what's it? Oh, jeez. That existence what's it called by? Anyway, some of that stuff gets pretty wordy, right? So, and even Heidegger was kind of like that, right? So,
oh yeah, for sure.
Oh, for definite. But you know, the one thing about Heidegger I tried to point out to people is that Heidegger is a slog to go through. However, he's very thorough in his scholarship in the way that the books, which are actually not books, they're just transcriptions and edited lecture courses, are very consistent in their approach. Here's what I'm going to talk about. Here's a definition. Here's my explication of this definition. Now I'm going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this. You know, very, very systematic and very consistent in the way he approaches things. Definitely not poetic. That's Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Or the epigram style.
I'm gonna have to bow out any moment now. I've got a call coming in from somebody, but yeah. So I don't know if you guys yeah, it's going to be pretty rapid for me here, actually. So I don't know if you guys want to finish off film or you want to pick it up later.
We can start with literature next time if you guys want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to have enough time to treat literature. And I think with film here, I'm just quickly going through the notes I made myself on the essay, is that I mean, there's a couple things here. So if we go to, quickly page 52, talking about Jameson again, 1950s generation of modernist auteurs, being creators. So he says some theorists have responded by nominating a new generation of postmodern auteurs, including Nora Ephron, David Lynch, already covered, Quentin Tarantino, and Catherine Bigelow. Catherine Bigelow, I think she directed The Hurt Locker, which I've never seen. Yeah. So then continuing, he mentions Hitchcock and Rear Window. By the way, you guys ever seen Rear Window?
No.
Highly recommend it. Highly recommend you watch Hitchcock, period. Psycho, The Birds, and Rear Window. So, quickly, the premise of Rear Window is Jimmy Stewart. He's broken his leg and he's in an apartment. And he's looking at the people in the courtyard of his apartment complex in New York. And he believes he witnesses a murder across in the other building. A guy who's a traveling salesman murders his wife because she appears one day and then she doesn't appear. And then he seems to be acting suspiciously. So that's part of that's the main plot. And so then continuing, one quote from here is that in this development of a roller coaster sensibility, celebrating the visceral qualities of the image rather than focusing on narrative and characterization. Okay. So we're getting to the emotional impact of a film image instead of focusing on what is the story and what are the character development type of thing. Right. And I guess one could say is that that's been a lot or a good portion of movies that have come up within the past 20, 25 years, more the emotional impact. Because they're certainly formulaic, number one. They're certainly designed for a global audience, number two, unlike movies were 30, 40 years ago. And they definitely are compressed and they are simple in the story. You don't have to spend a lot of time really pacing yourself through a narrative. I mean, David Lynch is kind of the outlier in terms of the dreamlike quality of Mulholland Drive. But even if you look at movies like back from the 70s, if they're 2.5 hours or something like that, you definitely have to sit and you got to pay attention to the movie, to the story, to the character development, to the scenery, and things like that. Hell, there were even movies, one of which that comes to mind is Patton, which came out from 1970. Those are movies that actually had intermissions.
Yeah.
Because you're sitting in the theater for 3 hours, you're just like, I gotta pee. Yeah. So like halfway in, intermission, and it says up on the screen, intermission, and it plays music. You don't see that anymore.
Yeah. The only movies that length now are like the Lord of the Rings movies.
Yes, for sure.
I mean, you could argue that is what the modern Netflix binge is, right? Like the intermission is that 5 seconds where you get hit pause between an episode.
Sure,
that's a good analogy.
But to manifest it in a communal form, it just doesn't really exist, right? So
right, you were at the mercy of the film, whereas nowadays, because of so many different ways you can control the media, you can just say, "Boop, I got to go pee."
Yeah.
20 minutes later, you got to go get a snack. Boop, you hit pause.
Yeah.
Well, back in the 70s in those kind of movies, you couldn't easily do that. I mean, you could walk out of the theater. I'm old enough to remember when you had to do that. You're just like, shit, I hope I don't miss anything important. Yeah. And then there's that section about Face Off, which I don't think we're really going to have enough time for. So
so good.
So I'd like to make an executive decision. How about for next time, we resume with film, we focus on Face Off.
Sure.
Since that's the example that the author cared to cover here, and then we go into literature. Maybe even one of the other essays, like I don't know. We could talk about that later. This might actually go to an episode past this. It might actually be 4 episodes, long form.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's my executive decision. Do you guys concur?
I concur.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds good to me.
All right, so we'll leave it off here.
All right. So,
All
all right. I will say all the things I like to say at the end of my videos then, and then you guys can give any last words or plugs. So, thanks everyone for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hope you enjoyed it, getting into the details on postmodernism, particularly film and art, and we'll get into literature, like you said, next time. And thanks to everyone who likes and shares this video, and to those of you who subscribe to my channel, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. Really appreciate that. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. And any last words or plugs there, guys?
Trump is a simulacrum.
Very well said.
If you want the opposite way of looking at the world, check out Jonathan Peugeot or Paul Vanderklay, and they'll take all this chaos we create here and turn it into an ordered structure quite quickly. So
Okay.
that floats your boat.
All right. Cool. Thanks, guys. And thanks, everyone, for watching. And adios until next time.